My husband's mother hid our wedding invites, so I made her watch from the parking lot. I don't think I'll ever forget the image of her standing behind the hotel's iron gates clutching her clutch bag like it held her dignity, wearing that pale peach dress that looked far too close to bridal white. She wasn't shouting or crying. She just stood there frozen as the music played and the petals fell, watching through a narrow line of hedges as I walked down the aisle without her. That moment didn't happen because I wanted revenge. It happened because I had finally stopped pretending everything was fine. My name is Avril. I'm 34 years old and I organize sustainability summits for international firms across the U.S. I live in Boulder, Colorado in a two-bedroom apartment overlooking the Flatirons, and for most of my adult life I've worked behind the scenes making other people's missions shine. I like structure. I like silence in the morning, and lists that get completed. So when I met Liam Rivers at a zero-waste panel in Austin, and he offered me his last granola bar while waiting for the delayed keynote, I wasn't expecting it to be the beginning of anything. But Liam had that quiet magnetism some men carry without trying. He wasn't flashy or loud, just calmly attentive. We talked about composting infrastructure and Scandinavian zoning policy like it was flirtation. A week later, he sent me an email with a link to a podcast we had debated over. I replied with a counterpoint article. That was how it started. Liam moved to Boulder 6 months after we began dating. He worked in strategic communications for nonprofits, and we shared a passion for intentional living and decency that didn't have to be marketed. I liked that he wasn't threatened by my independence. I loved how he listened without trying to fix me. His mother, Lorraine Rivers, entered the picture a few months later when he invited me to spend Thanksgiving at her house just outside Denver. The house was warm, over-decorated with embroidered pillows and monogrammed hand towels. Lorraine greeted me with a hug that lasted just a few seconds too long and eyes that cataloged everything I wore. She told me my scarf reminded her of something she wore at 19, said the quinoa salad. I brought smelled very clean and offered me a sweater, because I must be cold in that kind of fabric. On the surface, it was all kindness. Underneath, I felt the temperature drop in the room every time Liam wasn't near us. That was my first lesson in Lorraine's charm. She didn't yell or insult. She just rearranged reality until you questioned your own memory of it. Liam adored his mother. She raised him alone after his father died of cancer when Liam was 7. They were close in that way. Only single-parent families sometimes are where boundaries blur between parent and best friend. I admired that bond, even envied it at first. I thought maybe with enough patience and generosity, she and I would grow close too. When Liam proposed on a hike at Chautauqua Park, I said yes before he even opened the box. It was a simple vintage ring, previously his grandmother's, ND. We spent the afternoon drinking cider and talking about a small spring wedding in the foothills. That evening, we drove to Lorraine's house to share the news. She smiled, offered a tight congratulations, then asked if we'd consider holding the ceremony at the country club where she used to work events. I laughed softly and said we had something more outdoorsy in mind. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes shifted. The first few weeks of planning were joyous. We set a date in May, picked a garden venue that had been on my vision board for years, and started narrowing the guest list to 100. Lorraine said she wanted to help however she could, and I gave her small tasks, at first collecting vintage vases from thrift stores, suggesting readings for the ceremony. It was manageable, until it wasn't. One day, she called to ask if we could invite her extended cousins from Wisconsin, even though Liam hadn't spoken to them in a decade. Then came suggestions for changing the officiant, adding a live harpist, removing my college roommate from the bridal party because she seems a bit too boisterous for photos. I tried to smile through it. I tried to involve her without giving up control. But control wasn't what Lorraine wanted. She wanted authorship. She wanted to rewrite the whole thing in her image. At first, I brushed off the tension. I told myself I could handle it, that every wedding had politics. But small things started to shift. Vendors began canceling without warning. The caterer stopped responding to my emails. My florist double-booked us. Liam started missing meetings with me, saying he had to drive Lorraine to a last-minute doctor's appointment or pick up something she'd forgotten. And then came the moment I couldn't explain away. I ran into a close friend at a cafe, someone I had confirmed was on our guest list. She congratulated me on the engagement but asked if we had postponed the wedding. Confused, I told her no, and she looked embarrassed. She said she'd heard from someone close to Liam that we were pushing the date back indefinitely. I went home, checked our wedding website, and found it still listed as May 14. I called the venue. They hadn't heard of any changes. I checked our RSVP email. Nothing. But something in my gut told me that wasn't the end of it. It wasn't until I asked Tessa, my best friend and bridesmaid, if she'd gotten her invitation that the final layer cracked. No, she said. I assumed you were sending them in a second batch. That was when I realized Lorraine had taken control of the mailing list. When I asked Liam about the invitations, he looked surprised, even a little embarrassed. He said his mom had offered to help address and mail them and that it seemed like a small, sweet gesture to lighten my load. I nodded slowly, forcing myself to breathe. I didn't want to start a fight, not yet. I simply asked him if he'd seen her send them. He said no, but that he trusted her. That word trusted hit harder than I expected. I didn't say much that night. I just sat on the edge of the bed while he brushed his teeth and stared at the neat pile of RSVP cards on the dresser, wondering how much of this wedding was still mine. The next morning, I checked the guest list again, then called 3 more people, each of whom should have received their invites by now. None of them had. My hands started shaking. I opened my laptop, reviewed our shared spreadsheet, and realized something that chilled me. The file had been opened the previous week from an IP address, not mine. I had shared it only with Liam, but he had told me he'd forwarded it to his mom so she could help. At that point, I stopped pretending. That afternoon, I called Dean Park, an old friend from college who had become a private attorney. Dean wasn't a detective, but he knew people who could trace digital activity. I told him I suspected someone was impersonating me and possibly interfering with the wedding. I didn't give too many details, just enough for him to take me seriously. He said he'd look into it and call me in a few days. I spent that night quietly reviewing every interaction I had had with Lorraine over the past month. The passive-aggressive texts about color schemes. The sudden changes in vendors' availability. The florist who emailed saying my bouquet style had been downgraded due to a budget correction. None of it had made sense at the time. Now it was starting to form a picture I didn't want to believe. 2 days later, Dean called. His voice was calm, but I could hear the tension underneath. He told me there had been a new Gmail address created using my full name with a minor spelling error. That account had sent more than 70 emails over the past week to various addresses, including some matching our wedding guest list. Most of the emails said the wedding had been postponed indefinitely due to a family emergency. Dean forwarded me a few samples. They were written in a formal, generic tone, the kind that sounds believable because it says just enough without revealing anything. My stomach dropped when I saw that the sender had signed off with warmly Avril and Liam. I hadn't written a single one of them. I didn't confront Liam right away. Instead, I drove to Lorraine's house unannounced. I used the spare key Liam had once given me in case of emergencies. I told myself this qualified. Her home was quiet, filled with that curated stillness that people use to disguise control. I moved quickly, knowing I had maybe 10 minutes before she returned from her regular Thursday brunch. Her office smelled like lavender and paper. I found a small white box tucked in the back of her closet. Inside were almost all of the original invitations, perfectly sealed and addressed untouched. My name was printed on every envelope. None of them had been mailed. Next to the box was a yellow notepad with names checked off in ink. I photographed everything, my breath shallow, my fingers steady in spite of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I left the house before Lorraine returned. That night, I told Liam we needed to talk. We met at a coffee shop off Pearl Street, away from anywhere familiar. I showed him the photos. I showed him the fake emails. I told him about the unopened invitations. He looked like someone had knocked the air out of him. He denied it at first weakly, then sat in silence for what felt like forever. Finally, he whispered, "This can't be true," but I could see the truth landing hard behind his eyes. I told him to call his mother to ask her where the invitations were. He put the call on speaker. Lorraine answered sweetly. When asked about the invites, she hesitated for only a beat before saying, "Of course I sent them, sweetheart. Why would you think otherwise?" Her voice didn't waver, but her lie was loud. Liam didn't speak much on the drive home. That night, he sat on the couch holding his phone for a long time, scrolling through the email evidence again. He apologized softly, brokenly, but his words didn't matter as much as what he did next. He picked up his keys and left. I didn't ask where he was going. I just watched him disappear down the hallway and hoped that whatever he confronted would lead to a line finally being drawn. Liam came home after midnight. He didn't speak right away. He stood in the entryway, still wearing the same button-down shirt from work, now rumpled and damp at the collar like he'd been sweating through the truth. I waited, not asking questions, not pushing. He finally sat down across from me, hands folded in front of him, like someone preparing to confess in a courtroom. "She admitted it," he said quietly. "She said she panicked, that she thought some of your friends were inappropriate guests. Then it snowballed." I didn't respond. He kept talking, trying to offer me her version of remorse. How she didn't mean for it to go this far. How she was willing to help fix it now. I asked him one question: "Do you believe her?" He looked at me for a long time, then shook his head. The next morning, Lorraine called me. Her voice was syrupy but sharp at the edges. She said she wanted to meet for coffee to clear the air. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a cafe halfway between our homes, neutral territory, but not really. She arrived wearing pearls and perfume I recognized from Thanksgiving. She smiled tightly and opened by saying how much she loved Liam and how hard it had been to feel left out. I said she wasn't left out, she had removed herself by interfering. Her eyes narrowed for a split second, then softened. "Let's not rehash everything. I'm trying to move forward," she said. I told her the only way to move forward was by acknowledging what she had done. She didn't respond. She reached into her bag, pulled out a notebook, and began listing names of guests she would personally call to correct the misunderstanding. I told her we'd handle it ourselves. When I got home, I opened the wedding website. It had been updated. The date field had been erased, replaced with the words "postponed, new date coming soon." I hadn't changed it. Liam hadn't changed it. Only one other person had login access, the one who had insisted on helping manage the technical stuff. I called the hosting service. The edit history showed an IP address in the Denver suburbs. It traced directly to Lorraine's home. I didn't cry. I just sat still for a long time, letting my mind settle into clarity. This wasn't sabotage out of misunderstanding. This was deliberate, repeated, coordinated. I called Marco, the security consultant who sometimes worked with Dean. I asked if he had handled private event security for weddings before. He said yes many times. I told him I wanted help creating a layered access system for a new venue. I hadn't picked one yet, but I knew I would. He didn't ask questions, just said, "Send me your non-negotiables." That night, I sat at my desk and began rebuilding the wedding from scratch. I contacted our original venue and informed them we might have to cancel. I didn't explain. I simply asked for a backup date. They didn't have one that worked. I moved on. Within 48 hours, I secured a new venue, a historic hotel in downtown Denver, with an enclosed rooftop garden and a private ballroom. It had an unexpected cancellation the same weekend we'd planned to marry. It wasn't what I had originally envisioned, but it was secluded, elegant, and most importantly controllable. I asked for a clause in the contract that allowed private guest vetting and restricted non-verified entries. They agreed. I contacted our most trusted vendors and gave them the new information. I didn't explain why. I simply said, "We've had an interference situation." Liam was involved every step of the way now. Something had changed in him. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. He no longer defended her. He no longer asked me to be patient. He watched as I removed her from all shared documents, updated the guest list privately, and created new digital invitations that could not be forwarded. "Do you want to tell her?" he asked me one evening while we were proofreading the new RSVP form. "Or should I?" I looked at him and said, "Not yet. Let's finish the structure first." And we did. Quietly, precisely, carefully. By the end of that week, we had built what Marco called a soft-sealed event. The location would be disclosed only 48 hours before to confirmed guests. Entry required both email and phone verification. There would be one point of access and one security lead. I felt no joy while setting it up, only resolve. Lorraine hadn't just crossed a boundary. She had erased it, rewritten the narrative, and expected applause. What she didn't know yet was that I wasn't trying to punish her. I was protecting what we were building, and she would have to watch it happen from the outside. 3 days before the wedding, Lorraine sent Liam a text message that read like an apology and a warning at once. She said she hoped he'd reconsider rushing into such a serious commitment, especially when he had so much ahead of him at work. She ended with a line that I couldn't stop thinking about. You deserve someone who builds with you, not around you. Liam didn't show me the message at first. I found it by accident when his phone lit up while he was folding laundry, and I saw her name sitting above that line like a final judgment. I didn't say anything in the moment. I just kept folding clothes, feeling the soft weight of the fabric in my hands while something colder settled in my chest. That night, Liam handed me his phone and said, "Read it. She sent others too. I'm done pretending they don't mean what they mean." He had finally reached the part of the story where he stopped being the bridge and started choosing a side. We had one final rehearsal dinner scheduled for close family and the small wedding party. I moved it from the original restaurant to a private room at the new hotel, informing only those on the secured guest list. Lorraine was not included. It wasn't an act of cruelty. It was a boundary clear, quiet, and necessary. That evening, as guests arrived one by one, and the energy in the room began to lift after months of tension, Liam looked more present than I had seen him in weeks. He gave a short toast, thanking everyone for their support and patience, and finished by saying, "We're here because we kept going. We kept choosing each other." Everyone clapped. I saw Tessa wipe the corner of her eye discreetly. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. That was enough. The next morning, I received a call from the hotel coordinator. She said someone had tried to reach the front desk, claiming to be my mother, insisting there had been a venue change and asking to confirm the time and room number. The name given was Elaine Levine, a name I had never used for any official records. The phone number traced back to a Denver area code. I thanked her and asked her to flag any further suspicious contact. Then I texted Marco. "We've had the first attempt. Please secure perimeter early," he replied within seconds. "Already on it." That same afternoon, our wedding website was attacked again. Someone attempted to change the RSVP page to reflect a new date in August and marked it by invitation only due to health risks. The IP was identical to the last breach. We reset the passwords, activated two-factor authentication, and blocked all access except for Liam and me. When I showed Liam the edit log, he stared at it for a long time, then nodded slowly and said, "She's not going to stop. She won't stop until it's her wedding or no wedding at all." We made one final decision that evening. We drafted a short message and sent it directly via email and text to every guest on our final confirmed list. It read, "Please do not engage with any messages regarding changes to the event unless they come directly from Avril or Liam. This is the final confirmed time and location. We appreciate your understanding." The replies were unanimously supportive. Some had already noticed odd messages. One friend said she received a message last week claiming we had eloped. Another said Lorraine had called her directly asking whether she thought we were truly ready to marry. By the time I closed my laptop, I had no doubt that Lorraine had spent weeks trying to unravel what we had been stitching together. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the soft hum of our apartment, thinking about how many people settle for peace on the surface. How many women before me had watched their wedding day become a battlefield of invisible compromises. I had drawn a line not because I hated Lorraine, but because I loved myself enough to say no more. Liam turned toward me just before dawn, eyes barely open, and whispered, "You still want this, right?" I nodded and whispered back, "But not if I have to keep hiding from her forever." He placed his hand on mine and said, "Then this is the last time she gets to decide anything." We got up quietly, dressed slowly, and left for the hotel before sunrise. Marco and his team were already stationed at every entrance. Tessa arrived next with my dress and coffee. She kissed my cheek and said, "You're getting married to a man who finally sees you fully. That's worth showing up for." I looked at myself in the mirror as I stepped into the silk and lace I had chosen months ago and realized I felt calm. Not perfect, not ecstatic, but calm. I knew who I was. I knew what I'd been through. And I knew exactly who was about to watch me walk down the aisle without an invitation. The wedding day arrived with a sky so clear it felt like the world was daring anything to go wrong. I stood by the window of the bridal suite watching the rooftop garden below come to life. Chairs were arranged in curved rows, the cherry blossom arch gently swayed in the spring breeze, and Marco's team moved quietly at the perimeters like stagehands before curtain. Everything looked exactly how I had hoped it would. Intentional, grounded, unshakable. But I wasn't looking for perfection. I just wanted it to be ours. At 10:07 a.m., Marco slipped into the room, held out a folded note, and waited for me to read it. Lorraine had arrived. She'd attempted to talk her way through the side entrance, claimed there had been a medical emergency and that she needed to speak with me privately before the ceremony. When the front desk asked for identification, she refused and insisted she was the groom's mother. Security offered her water and a shaded bench outside the gate. She was now sitting in the parking area with a partial view of the garden. She had stopped trying to get in. Marco wrote one last line that stayed with me longer than I expected. "She's watching, that's all." I didn't react. I handed the note to Tessa, who read it and quietly tucked it into her clutch without saying a word. I let the information land where it needed to. Lorraine's presence didn't change the vow I had written. It didn't change the man waiting at the end of the aisle. And it didn't change the way I wanted to begin this next part of my life. I closed my eyes, exhaled slowly, and reminded myself that control wasn't about forcing others to behave. It was about choosing your own response. When the music started, I walked arm in arm with my father, who said nothing but squeezed my wrist at the top of the aisle in a way that told me he knew everything without asking. I didn't look toward the parking lot. I didn't need to. I saw Liam's face and the way he blinked fast to keep the tears from falling too soon. That was enough. As we said our vows, I spoke clearly, not for the guests, not for the photos, but for the woman I had become while building this boundary. I told him I would build with him, not around him, and that our future would be something we both authored free from shadows. The ceremony ended with the soft rise of applause and the scent of lemon blossoms drifting on the breeze. It was quiet, it was earned. During the reception, people laughed, danced, and let the tension of the past months fall away one toast at a time. Liam kept his hand on mine most of the night. I noticed that each time someone mentioned the beauty of the venue or the intimacy of the crowd, he smiled with a mix of relief and quiet pride. He was no longer stuck between two versions of his life. He had chosen one. Later, as the cake was being cut, Marco walked up and informed us there had been one final attempt. Lorraine had tried to come through the rear garden gate, saying she had simply stepped out earlier and lost her way. A staff member had seen her pacing along the side of the building. When security approached, she froze and then backed away. She didn't argue, she didn't cry, she just walked back to her car. Marco offered to delete the surveillance stills. Liam looked at me and asked, "Do you want to keep the photo?" I thought for a moment, then nodded. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. Some stories deserve to be remembered exactly as they happened. We left the reception late, surrounded by friends who had seen the full arc of our story unfold and chose to stay with us anyway. As guests blew bubbles around us and soft music played from the terrace, I glanced back once, not for her, but for myself. I needed to remember that I hadn't run. I had stayed, stood still, and allowed someone to reveal herself fully. That was the moment I stopped seeing Lorraine as an obstacle and started recognizing her as a mirror for everything I would never become. In the car ride to the hotel where we'd stay before our honeymoon flight, Liam reached for my hand. "You never wavered," he said softly. I shook my head. "I did. I just didn't let it make the final decision." He nodded, understanding. That night, as we packed our things and prepared for a week away, I didn't feel like I'd won. I felt like I had repaired something quietly shattered, and that was a different kind of strength. Our honeymoon wasn't extravagant. We chose a quiet stretch of coastline in the Yucatan where the cell signal was weak and the air smelled like salt and citrus. For the first time in months, we could hear ourselves think without interference. We slept deeply, walked barefoot on stone paths between cenotes, and talked about everything but the wedding. It wasn't about pretending nothing had happened. It was about choosing where to focus, now that we had weathered the storm. On the fifth night, sitting under a lantern-lit patio wrapped in bug netting, Liam reached across the table, his palm open waiting. "I know this isn't over," he said, voice steady. "But I'm ready to learn how to keep it from breaking us again." I didn't respond right away. I watched his face in the soft light, saw the lines that had deepened in the last few months, not from age, but from clarity. And I finally said what I'd been holding in since the ceremony. "We can't go back to hoping she changes on her own. We need a structure that doesn't depend on her willingness." When we returned to Colorado, we made an appointment with a therapist who specialized in boundary work and in-law dynamics. Her name was Dr. Ellen Vaughn, and during the first session, she listened without blinking as we explained what had unfolded. At the end of our story, she folded her hands in her lap and said something that stayed with me longer than most wedding advice ever had. "Healthy relationships are not built on guilt or access, they're built on agreements. You don't owe anyone unlimited access to your life, not even family." It was a sentence that unlocked something between us. For the first time, we gave ourselves permission to make rules without apology. The first boundary we set was phone contact. Lorraine would only be calling once a week, not daily, and all visits would be planned at least 5 days in advance. There would be no more unannounced drop-ins, no more side conversations with Liam that I wasn't aware of. We sent her an email explaining this clearly together and asked for her acknowledgement before we resumed any in-person interaction. Her reply came 3 days later. It was short. "I'm disappointed. I've always put this family first, but I suppose this is what you've decided." She didn't say our names, she didn't agree. But she didn't fight either, for Lorraine's silence was often the sharpest weapon. Weeks passed. We lived our lives. We cooked meals, and returned to work, and tried to make ordinary things feel ordinary again. I could feel Liam holding steady, even when she left voicemails filled with pauses designed to stir doubt. I watched him grow into the kind of partner who didn't just choose me in ceremony, but in repetition. He no longer defended her, he explained her, then made a decision anyway, and for me that changed everything. Then just after our 2-month mark, I found out I was pregnant. It wasn't planned, but it wasn't unwelcome either. I sat on the bathroom floor with the test in my hand, knees pulled to my chest, not crying, not smiling, just breathing. When I told Liam later that night, he froze for a beat, then broke into the kind of smile that made all those hard months worth enduring. He pulled me close and whispered, "We're going to do this better than how it started." I nodded, even as my mind raced ahead. I already knew Lorraine would see this baby as her second chance. I just wasn't sure if we were willing to play along. A week later, we told her. We invited her to meet us at a public cafe in Denver. No house visits, no private ambush. She arrived in a beige trench coat and that familiar tight smile. We said it plainly, no build-up. "We're expecting," Liam told her. For a moment, her face lit up in a way that almost softened everything. But then she looked at me, and the light dimmed just slightly. "I hope you'll let me be involved this time," she said carefully. I watched Liam's face shift. "Mom," he said, "not unkindly, you'll be involved if you respect the boundaries. We're not doing this the old way." Her eyes welled up a little, not quite tears, just enough to remind us that guilt was always close by. "I'll try," she said finally. "I don't want to lose my grandchild the way I almost lost you." We didn't interpret that as a breakthrough, but it was a start, and sometimes a quiet start is more trustworthy than a loud apology. Pregnancy softened some parts of me. I didn't expect, but it sharpened others. I became more deliberate, more precise with my energy. I stopped entertaining conversations that exhausted me. I declined events out of obligation. I started trusting my own discomfort without needing to justify it. Lorraine, to her credit, surprised us during those early months. She asked before buying things. She offered help without pushing it. She even attended a grandparenting class at the hospital, something I never would have expected from her before. And yet I never fully relaxed. Because patterns don't vanish. They recede, waiting for moments of tension to reappear. At 7 months, we held a small baby shower, with only close friends and a few of Liam's relatives. Lorraine was invited, but with clear instructions. No surprise guests, no speeches, no games that made anyone uncomfortable. She showed up in a pale blue blouse, brought a hand-knitted blanket, and spent most of the afternoon quietly smiling from the corner. When she left, she thanked me for including her. It was the first time her voice didn't sound rehearsed. I didn't praise her. I didn't overextend. I just said thank you and held the door as she walked out. Liam had started attending therapy on his own by that point. It was something he brought up, not me. He said he needed space to understand how much of his life had been built around managing other people's emotions, especially his mother's. I supported him not because I needed him to change for me, but because I knew the version of him that could set boundaries was the version that would raise our child with clarity. And slowly that version began to show up more often. He stopped answering her texts immediately. He stopped apologizing when we made a decision she didn't like. He began treating her like a relative, not a force. When Emma was born, Lorraine visited at the hospital during designated hours. She brought a small stuffed bear and sat quietly while we held our daughter. She didn't reach to take her from me. She didn't correct how we swaddled her or suggest what to feed her. She simply asked, "May I hold her?" I said yes. And for a moment, something gentle passed between us. Not friendship, not reconciliation. Just mutual presence. She held Emma for 10 minutes, then handed her back and said, "You're doing better than you think." It was the closest thing to encouragement I had ever heard from her. But the real test came weeks later when she stopped by unannounced. She knocked twice holding a casserole and a bag of groceries. I didn't open the door. Instead, I called Liam from the bedroom and waited. He walked to the door, opened it only halfway, and said firmly, "We've talked about this. No visits without asking first." She blinked surprised, then tried to smile through the awkwardness. "I just wanted to help," she said. Liam didn't argue. He simply said, "That's not how we do things anymore." She stood there for a second longer, then nodded and turned away. I watched from the hallway, heart pounding, not because of confrontation, but because I knew that moment mattered more than any apology. That was when I realized this wasn't about winning. It wasn't about getting her to finally admit what she had done or earning her approval. It was about consistency. About not folding every time someone cried or claimed good intentions. It was about modeling for our daughter what love looked like when it included boundaries. And it was about choosing peace without inviting chaos into the room every time it knocked. Lorraine didn't disappear after that, but she changed her rhythm. She asked before visiting. She showed up for birthdays and holidays with appropriate gifts and left when the event was over. She didn't insert herself into parenting decisions. She still had moments where her voice carried a familiar edge, but Liam handled them with quiet firmness, and I didn't have to step in. That in itself was healing. Emma turned 1 last month. We threw a small party in the park with picnic blankets and homemade cupcakes. Lorraine brought paper plates and napkins, which she handed to me with a smile, and said, "I figured you had everything else covered." I thanked her. She didn't stay long, just long enough to watch Emma smear icing across her chin and giggle at the birds. Before leaving, she crouched beside me and said softly, "You've built a good thing here. I hope I don't mess it up again." I didn't respond with a grand gesture. I just said thanks for saying that. Because sometimes the most powerful repair doesn't come with a dramatic apology. It comes in the quiet repetition of new behavior. There's something strange about peace when you've lived so long inside the architecture of conflict. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't feel like triumph. It just settles into your life quiet and almost suspicious in its calm. After Emma's first birthday, I noticed how often I stopped waiting for the next disaster. For the first time in years, I wasn't checking my email for sabotage details or intercepting vendor calls with dread. I didn't have to screen my phone for Lorraine's name or brace myself before family gatherings. That silence didn't mean we were best friends. It meant we had finally stopped pretending things would fix themselves if we just smiled hard enough. And that shift changed everything. Liam and I grew steadier, not because we forgot what we'd been through, but because we built something stronger in the aftermath. We made decisions faster, parented with more clarity, and no longer argued about how much of his mother's voice should echo through our own home. She still had moments. That didn't surprise me. What mattered was what happened after. When she once emailed an article about how children need extended family to develop fully, Liam responded with a simple, "We've got this. Thanks for thinking of us." No tension, no war, just a quiet refusal to re-enter the loop. And maybe that was the real reward, not watching someone else change, but watching yourself no longer be shaken by who they choose to stay. Lorraine continued to show up in small, manageable ways. She brought Emma books on holidays, some useful, some a little outdated. She asked about our schedules before inviting herself into our weekends. She kept her opinions to herself when we told her we were enrolling Emma in a nature-based preschool instead of the private academy she once suggested. And when we told her we wouldn't be traveling for Christmas that year, she didn't sulk. She mailed gifts early and sent a handwritten note saying, "Thank you for creating space. I hope the holidays bring you rest." I wasn't sure if that line had been ghostwritten by guilt or personal growth, but I didn't analyze it. I just read it once, placed it on the fridge with a magnet, and moved on with my day. That's what healing looks like sometimes. Not applause, not closure, just the quiet decision to keep going without dragging the old weight behind you. What surprised me most was how this new version of our life didn't make me bitter. It made me more empathetic, especially with other women who reached out to me privately after seeing glimpses of our dynamic. Some of them were colleagues, others acquaintances. A few of them were strangers who had heard pieces of our story through mutual friends. Each one told a version of the same experience: a mother-in-law who crossed the line, a partner who hesitated too long to choose a side, a wedding that became more about survival than celebration. They weren't looking for advice. They were looking for validation. A reminder that they weren't imagining the manipulation, that they weren't ungrateful, overly sensitive, or dramatic. And I told them what I had learned slowly and carefully. You can be kind and still say no. You can love someone and still choose yourself. There's a power in reclaiming a narrative that others tried to distort, and there's dignity in letting your decisions speak louder than your defense. I didn't post our story online. I didn't confront Lorraine in public or make her grovel in front of family. I let the truth unfold the way it always does, with time, with evidence, with consistency. And now, years later, the thing I'm proudest of is not the wedding we salvaged, but the marriage we preserved. Last week, Liam and I celebrated our 4th anniversary. We didn't do anything extravagant. We made dinner at home, let Emma stay up late, and watched an old documentary about coral reef restoration while sipping tea. At one point, Liam reached across the table, touched my wrist, and said, "You made this possible. You didn't let us get lost in her storm." I smiled, not because I needed the credit, but because I had almost forgotten how many days I spent wondering if I was asking too much simply by drawing the line. And now it's just a given. We have space. We have protection. We have each other. The thing no one tells you about toxic family dynamics is how much they rely on performance. Once you stop participating in the act, the story loses power. It doesn't end, but it no longer runs your life. Some people imagine healing as a grand gesture, like a moment when the person who hurt you begs for forgiveness or the pain disappears all at once. But that's not how it happened for me. Healing looked like quiet Saturday mornings where I didn't feel anxious checking my phone. It looked like putting up a family calendar without wondering who might try to rearrange it. It looked like raising my daughter in a home where I didn't have to translate or defend the way I protected us. And most of all, it looked like not thinking about Lorraine every time something meaningful happened. I hadn't erased her from our life. I had just stopped letting her shape the center of it. There were still moments where the old tension reappeared, but the difference now was how little space we gave it. A year ago, she sent Emma a birthday card with a note that said, "Maybe someday we can have the relationship I never got to have with your mother." I read it once, placed it in a drawer, and never mentioned it again. Not because it didn't sting, not because I had become indifferent, but because I had learned which battles weren't mine to dignify. Liam saw the card a few weeks later while looking for something in the drawer. He didn't say much, just nodded once, and quietly took it out of the house during his next walk to the mailbox. Emma is now 3. She's smart and wildly observant, the kind of child who notices when someone's tone changes before their words do. Sometimes, she asks questions about family that catch me off guard. Why does Grandma always bring her own snacks? Or, how come she hugs Daddy longer than she hugs you? I answer her the way I wish I had been answered when I was younger, honestly but without weight. Grandma is still learning how to share space, I told her once. And some people take longer to understand love that includes rules. She nodded like that. Made perfect sense. then went back to stacking blocks. That's what I want her to know. That love can be real and still have limits. That we can forgive and still expect better. And that setting boundaries doesn't mean cutting people off. It means choosing where your energy goes and where it doesn't. The last real conversation I had with Lorraine happened just before Emma started preschool. She called, asked if we could meet, and I agreed to coffee in a public place. She didn't open with flattery or guilt. She simply said, "I know I made a mess of your wedding and a lot of things after, and I know I haven't apologized in the way you probably deserved." I let her speak without interruption. She continued, "I wanted control because I thought I was losing Liam. But I realize now I wasn't losing him. I was being asked to make room. I didn't respond with praise or validation. I just said, it's not about the past anymore. It's about how you show up from here." She nodded, said she understood, and for once didn't ask for anything in return. I walked away from that conversation lighter, not because it fixed anything, but because I hadn't carried her feelings home with me. That's what boundary work does. It doesn't stop conflict. It stops the confusion over whose emotions belong to who. In the months that followed, I watched her adjust her rhythm again. Fewer gifts, more quiet presence, less commentary, more offers to help without expectation. And though I didn't always accept, I appreciated the shift. Liam and I often reflect on how far we've come, not with bitterness, but with a kind of reverent exhaustion. We didn't just survive something, we redesigned the foundation underneath it. And every time we disagree or face a new challenge, we remind each other that this marriage was built not on avoiding conflict, but learning how to come back to the same table after it. That is something Lorraine's generation never learned. And maybe in some way we are teaching her now. There's no perfect ending to stories like these. Just layers of repair built one moment at a time. A boundary held. A pause before reacting. A decision not to repeat an old script. And if we're lucky, a child who grows up knowing that love can be strong, without being loud, and that peace is something you protect, not something you wait for. It's strange how full-circle moments don't announce themselves. They arrive in silence inside ordinary days that feel like any other until something clicks quietly inside your chest. Last weekend, we attended a wedding. Not ours. A colleague of Liam's was getting married in the mountains, and we were invited as guests. No organizing, no drama, no hidden lists. I stood at the back of the small ceremony space with Emma on my hip, watching two people exchange vows in front of snow-dusted pines. The wind was sharp but not cruel, and the sky held a softness I remembered from the morning of our own wedding. Liam leaned in and whispered, "Can you believe it's been almost 5 years?" I smiled but said nothing. Because yes, I could believe it. We had felt every minute of it. After the ceremony, while guests were mingling, I noticed Lorraine a few feet away. I hadn't realized she would be here. Apparently, she knew the groom's parents through an old community program. She spotted us at the same time and gave a small wave. Not dramatic, not possessive, just acknowledgement. I returned the wave, then turned back to Emma, who was now tugging at my sleeve for more juice. That moment would have wrecked me years ago. Now it felt like brushing past an old bruise. It didn't hurt anymore, but I hadn't forgotten where it used to. Later that night, while tucking Emma into bed, she asked if she could invite Grandma to her spring recital. I looked at her small face, wide-eyed and hopeful, and realized she wasn't asking out of pressure or guilt. She genuinely wanted her there. And I knew the answer had nothing to do with Lorraine. It had to do with what kind of mother I wanted to be. One who taught protection through avoidance, or one who modeled strength through discernment. I nodded and said, "We'll talk to Daddy and figure it out together." She seemed satisfied with that and rolled over to find her stuffed rabbit. In the quiet afterward, I sat by the window and thought about everything it took to get here, all the moments I wanted to give up, all the times I questioned if love was enough when the people around it tried to bend it out of shape. I thought about the woman I used to be sitting in front of a pile of unsent invitations, still trying to make excuses for someone else's sabotage, and I wished she could see this version of us now. Not perfect, not easy, but deeply intact. Liam joined me a few minutes later, a cup of tea in each hand. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. There's a peace that comes from weathering something real together. From knowing you didn't just stay, you rebuilt. He set down the mug and said, "You know, I used to think protecting my mother meant shielding her from discomfort. Now I think it means not letting her hurt anyone else with it." I nodded slowly. "And protecting us means not waiting for her to undo the past. Just making sure it doesn't repeat." That's the thing about toxic family patterns. They don't end because one person says sorry. They end because someone finally decides not to pass them on. And sometimes, the most powerful comeback is not revenge or confrontation. It's becoming the kind of person who no longer needs either. If you've ever had to protect your peace from someone who claimed to love you the most, you know what I mean. If you've ever been asked to shrink to keep the illusion of family harmony intact, maybe this story sounds a little too familiar. And if you're standing at the start of your own boundary line wondering whether it's worth the fight, maybe the better question is this: what would your life look like if you stopped waiting for their approval and started honoring your own?